Hello, welcome to the University of Brighton podcast. I'm Richard Newman. In this podcast, we celebrate our students and staff, hit on a few topical issues as well, and shine a light on the amazing work going on in the university. It's LGBT History Month, and to celebrate that and to reflect as well, I'm joined by three members of our staff to have a chat. They are Dr Nick McGlynn, Senior Lecturer in Human Geography, Sarah Pickett, co-chair of the LGBT Plus Staff Network, and Sam Oliver, Team Administrator for the Disability and Dyslexia team. Thank you for joining me. We'll start with the month itself. What are your thoughts on how important it is to have this period dedicated to LGBT history?
I think it is really important. I think it always is in any year, but maybe more so this year, because I guess it's obviously tough on a lot of us at the moment, but I think particularly for LGBT plus people, it's quite difficult to sort of connect with the community, and maybe people are kind of more isolated and sort of I think there's kind of a real need to make people feel connected and also aware of LGBT history and hopefully kind of celebrate that as well as recognizing the challenges and I guess the places we still have to go. It's I think it's, for me anyway, personally, I'm kind of like really wanting to engage with a bit of fun and a bit of a sense of joy and creativity and those sort of aspects. So that's, I think there's a lot of reasons why we need to be celebrating and recognizing it.
Yeah, I agree with what Sam was saying, really. I suppose it's great to look at stuff that's happened, maybe for younger people as well, to kind of be aware of stuff that's happened before and where some of the movements that are happening now. For instance, I remember there's a lot of struggles still around trans issues and trans awareness, and I remember even in the 80s having to have those fights with the Women's Centre about whether trans women should be allowed and stuff like that. So I think looking back at history can give you kind of ideas about where a lot of this stuff comes from. I think it's just good to have that space to highlight stuff, to raise awareness, to look at how things have changed and as Sam said, how things still need to change.
Yeah, I agree with Sarah. I think I'm sorry to give the standard lecturer's academics answer to this, but I think it's a really useful learning opportunity. I think thinking about it as LGBT History Month and thinking about that historical aspect is really important, because our movements do have very long histories, very interesting histories. Lots of the, as Sarah points out, lots of the kind of like debates and issues that seem really kind of like fresh and new and appearing out of nowhere today are actually very long-standing. And I think it was really important when I was younger, when I was understanding myself as gay. A really important thing for me was to read what older LGBT people had said, and to understand myself as kind of positioned within that kind of history. That was really helpful to me, and I think it's something that I still would recommend to any younger LGBT people, is think about it as LGBT History Month. Read that history and kind of learn where this has come from, and that can give us some kind of signposts for where we might be going as well.
Yeah, and I wonder as well, how much you think it cuts through to wider society, and how much it really should do as well beyond the LGBT plus community, because how important is that everyone can get involved with these events, because like you said, we can't really go forward without really knowing where we've been, and that applies to everyone.
Yeah, definitely. And as I said, it's a long history. It's a complex history. It doesn't just happen in one country. It's happened across the world. And sometimes, well, very often, in fact, until the past 15 years or so, it wouldn't have been described as LGBT history. It might in some places and sometimes not even be described as a lesbian and gay history. So it might be quite difficult to understand where this stuff has been happening and where it's come from. But that's what makes it so interesting. But yeah, I think in terms of kind of learning about that history beyond just kind of LGBT people, I think it is really important. I think it's important to see where LGBT movements have fit into other movements, activist movements, social movements, even political movements in the past, and to understand LGBT issues as kind of like woven throughout society rather than being kind of like packaged off somewhere.
Yeah, so I mean, if we talk generally about progress in terms of equality, clearly things have changed over the years. It's such recent history where the most archaic and disgraceful laws were in place, which you can't even imagine the impact of. In recent years, and we'll stick to England here because it gets a bit more complicated when we start looking into the UK as a whole. But same-sex marriage has come into law in past decades. Primary school kids learn about LGBT plus now. Where are we lacking though? Where do you really think we need to be making more progress?
I mean, I think there are still challenges in education. It was only 2019 when 21 MPs actually still voted against LGBT inclusive education in schools. So we're definitely, and with the rise of academy schools who, although they have to teach the curriculum, there are things that they can leave out and not teach and stuff like that. I think with education, we've got a long way to come still, although it is better, obviously.
I agree with you, Sarah. And I think one thing that I know happened, I think it was last year, was that a load of funding got cut for LGBT charities that basically helps tackle LGBT bullying. So that was, quite a big step back on that front. And I think as well, I suppose I have a bit of a kind of health and social care, or mental health kind of, I've worked in mental health quite a while before. So I'm quite focused on things like the NHS and kind of service provision. And I think in a lot of those areas, we have kind of, we still have a lot of surveys showing that both kind of staff and service users feel, who are LGBT, feel essentially that they're not getting the same treatment, that they're not getting kind of services that really meet their specific needs. I think in a lot of ways we still have a need for sort of LGBT plus specific services because mainstream services are not doing what they should. For example, in Brighton, we've got Mind Out, which is an amazing LGBT plus mental health charity. And, I think we need more services like that around the country because I think we're quite lucky down here, but, elsewhere it's pretty patchy.
Yeah, I mean that really kind of jibes with my experience. My PhD thesis actually, which I completed about 5 years ago, was about exactly these kinds of issues, what it was like for LGBT community groups, services, charities, as well as the public sector to be trying to promote LGBT rights, to trying to provide LGBT focused services at the same time as their funding had been devastated. And it was incredibly difficult, and we're still seeing the after effects of that happening right now. So I think that is a really serious issue, and it's something that comes up in my research all the time. I work with Mind Out and other services, is that most LGBT people do want LGBT specific services not just because of issues of fierce discrimination, but because there are some LGBT specific issues that they might need dealt with. I also think it's obviously the case that for bi people, for trans people, for asexual people and others, there's a lot more needed in terms of support and sometimes even just recognition across the country's social life. At the same time, like I'm I'm very influenced by queer scholars and academics and activists who've pointed out that a lot of like lesbian and gay, and I say that very specifically, lesbian and gay inclusion success stories have been about establishing ways for us to fit into existing social norms and lifestyles. And I think there's been less kind of challenge to the kind of mainstream ways in which our social lives are lived. So I'm certainly obviously very happy that there's been a lot of progress in terms of including LGBT people, but I'm always a bit mindful about what are we being included in, and is there stuff that we are being included in that could actually do with being shaken up in some ways.
I'm interested, Sam, a point that you made, that you felt that there were some good services in Brighton, but maybe elsewhere it's lacking a little bit. And sort of following on from that, really, Brighton's an area which is incredibly inclusive in lots of ways. Do you feel like it can sometimes be a little bit of a bubble? Have you ever had a situation where you feel so comfortable in your surroundings in and around Brighton and Hove that you can go somewhere else and you feel a bit of an outsider somewhere else, not really that far away, just down the road?
I think Brighton can feel a bit of a bubble. I think sometimes, certainly when I come from the northeast and when I go up there, I do notice a difference in some ways. But I also think we can kind of get, I wouldn't say fooled, but we can sometimes maybe get too comfortable. You've only got to look at the fact that 2 gay men were attacked and beaten up on the seafront. I think it was a year or so ago. In terms of being safe, it's not, and I don't think anywhere is totally safe for LGBT people. And I think it would be dangerous to think Brighton is, always wonderful, because it isn't. However, yeah, it is. There are a lot more here. There's a lot more here for LGBT people than there is, on the estate that I was brought up on in the northeast. So yeah, there are differences, but and that's why I've stayed in Brighton probably for so long. I moved here in 81, but I don't want us to get too complacent.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, Sarah. And I think Brighton's probably the place that I felt the most at home, and I've kind of moved around quite a few places in the UK, and I'm from London originally, which is also pretty kind of diverse, tolerant place in a lot of ways. But I think the thing with Brighton that I find is that there's kind of more warmth down here for me. I sort of feel there's kind of just a different sort of atmosphere. But at the same time, I've experienced sort of being stereotyped and kind of direct sort of homophobia down here. Thankfully, nothing kind of very violent, but certainly things that made me feel quite uncomfortable and quite sort of stigmatized. So it's I think I've had conversations with people where they've been like, oh, but Brighton, anything goes in Brighton and everyone's it's all great, isn't it? It's one big like LGBT paradise. And I'm like, no, no, definitely not. There's still plenty of issues. It's just I think it's safer than a lot of other places, but there's still a lot of problems.
Yeah, that's definitely how I feel as well. I was brought up near to Glasgow, a bit further north than Glasgow, and quickly after I moved to Brighton, like it felt like the most comfortable place for me as a gay man. And I think sometimes it can be easy to forget that it really does feel different here, really different. So like when I visit my boyfriend in Belfast, or when I travel back up to Scotland, or even to London, anywhere else, I suddenly think, oh yeah, this does feel a bit different to Brighton actually. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe there's just a kind of atmosphere, or there's a kind of just a generalised feeling of greater safety and comfort in Brighton. But at the same time, as both Sarah and Sam have mentioned, I've experienced random homophobic abuse in the street here, avid folk shouting things at me from cars. So it does still happen here. It's not a utopia by any means, but it probably is still one of the best places in the country.
And if you're comparing that a little bit as well, Nick, to Belfast, interesting you saying that with your boyfriend being in Belfast, where the situation is a lot more complicated. in Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, and you know, we know the issues there as well. How does he feel about the situation where he lives?
I mean, I can't really kind of speak for him too much. I will say that I have been to Belfast to do a bit of field work on LGBT communities there, and not know at the time, not knowing much about kind of Northern Ireland's kind of situation and context with kind of LGBT rights and stuff. I was kind of struck by how different it felt, and how a lot of the people that I spoke to said to me, rightly, you've got to understand it's not the same here as it is in England. And that the people that I spoke to there said, we do feel it's far more blatantly homophobic here than it is in other places in the UK. That's not to say that there is not a large LGBT community in Belfast. There is, and there's a lot of really fantastic, really innovative LGBT activism and campaigning happening around Belfast. But I do think that kind of points to, as a human geographer, that there are kind of like spatial differences and variations in kind of LGBT acceptance and inclusion across the UK.
What about the university in general? Inclusivity, a core value for the uni. Students speak quite positively about it, feeling, again, I guess similarly to what we were just saying, a safer space than maybe some people may have come from other areas of the country or areas of the world, in fact. What have been your experiences with what they've told you? What were your experiences of the university in general about how it supports people who are coming to the university who maybe like finding out a lot more about themselves?
I've not actually worked at the university for too long, but I was in the team I'm in a few years ago, kind of for sort of temp period, and yeah, I think, you know, so my experiences are quite general, but overall I do feel the university seems like a pretty inclusive, you know, welcoming kind of space. Again, relatively speaking, you know, I think there's always things that could be improved, but yeah, it's, you know, I think just speaking for myself as a member of staff, like I probably felt the most kind of accepted and welcomed very quickly in the team I'm in, compared to anywhere else I've been. So, and I don't know how much of that is like specifically as someone who identifies as queer, but like it's just been my experience here. So I think and I've been very able to just talk about, yeah, kind of boyfriend or, you know, whatever my experience is. So yeah, that's been really nice for me.
I've been at the university in a bunch of different capacities. I've had a bunch of different jobs here, and I did my PhD and my postdoc here as well. So I've been both student and a variety of different types of staff here. And I have always felt not just safe, but also very supported and even encouraged to be open about being gay here, and to teach about LGBTQ issues in my class, which is what I specialise in, is kind of LGBTQ geographies. So I'm really pleased, and some of the stuff that I teach about is probably quite pushes at the boundaries of what people might think is acceptable. In terms of, we talk about sex, we talk about sexual practices and sexual cultures, and we use some kind of like sexualized imagery in my classes, but I've always felt that the university has my back on that kind of stuff, and they know that I'm engaging with these issues from an academic perspective and an educational perspective, and as I said, that the university has my back. And also with regard to the university more widely, I mean, it's so easy for LGBTQ equalities to become a bit of a tick box exercise at universities. Like, oh, we'll get our rainbow flags up this month. We'll use the hashtag in our social media. Make sure everyone's done their mandatory equalities training online. But at the University of Brighton, I really do feel that there is a culture of supporting LGBTQ people here that's kind of baked into the university, and also in trying to improve how we do that. And I don't say that kind of thing lightly. And I think it also just helps that there are a lot of us working here.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's slightly different. I don't work for the university. My day job is I work for the student union in a student union office, front facing. So a lot of my work is just dealing with students, chatting to students. So it really isn't I mean, I've worked here for 23 years, I hate to say, for the student union. But so, you know,
You love
for
to
students,
say, Sarah.
yeah, yeah, sorry, I love to say it. I just mean it's a long time. But yeah, the students, for them, it's kind of not an issue, but they're a brilliant thing. So when we introduced pronoun badges, you know, certainly at Grand Prix, where I work, the badges just went within like 2 seconds. I kept having to ask for more because students were really keen to have to wear them, you know. But it's always, I mean, I was out as bi from the second I started work here, and I've never personally not experienced anything, you know, any problems, and I think it is a very inclusive space. But I'm always working in student union areas, so, you know, obviously that's slightly different. But no, I think Nick's right. I think it is a very accepting and encouraging, and, you know, which isn't to say that there's not any problems. You know, I certainly have noticed with a colleague who's now not with us at the university, a trans colleague, I kind of noticed the kind of odd looks, microaggressions and stuff like that sometimes when I walked around with them. But actually, as a general thing, I think the university is a pretty safe space, and it is very inclusive and encouraging. And as Nick said, there's a large amount of LGBT staff, so, you know, that's always a plus.
Yeah, and following on from that, really touched upon it in the previous question as well, but related specifically to students who, as I said, that, you know, learning so much about themselves, they may be leaving home for the first time, so they're really gaining true independence, where they can really start to become who they really feel like they want to be, who they are. So for anyone who may be feeling anxious about accepting who they are, or feeling anxious about people accepting who they are, and about telling the people that are closest to them about themselves.
I'm always wary about giving any advice to anyone, because I think, you know, yeah, everyone's process of self-acceptance and sort of telling people about who they are is so different. I think the one thing that I would really say, you know, based on my own experience, is like, find your community, find your sort of chosen family and people that do really, you know, accept you and encourage you without conditions and without kind of any expectations on that. Because I think a lot of, if you can find that somewhere, then even if you then face, you know, challenges and difficulties with responses down the road, you've kind of got that base, and you can kind of develop quite a lot of security, and yeah, in your relationships, but also in yourself. And yeah, that's definitely something that I found very strengthening along the way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Sam's points there. Like, I'm far be it for me to kind of be giving kind of this easy advice about here's what you should do. But Sam's absolutely right. Like, don't think that you have to follow other people's trajectories that they've gone down for this kind of thing. Do what you think works for you, and also, yeah, I completely agree about finding a kind of a community, which is so important, to find these kind of like-minded people. Unfortunately, you probably will find that in Brighton.
Yeah, I think you've both said it. Oh, it is very difficult to give advice because everybody's experience is so different. You know, I didn't even admit to myself that I was bi until I was 28. So, you know, I'm not necessarily the best person to be giving advice, but definitely finding your community and people who are like-minded, I think, is one of the major things.
Yeah, I think probably phrased that maybe not quite the right way in terms of it being direct advice. Maybe more anecdotal experiences may often feel beneficial to someone else. It may strike home with, you know, 1-2 people that may be listening to this, I guess, is more the point, I guess. But what about allyship? I think, Sarah, you might be a good person to talk about this maybe. How useful is something like that? I guess really we kind of want to get to a point, don't we, where an allyship is completely pointless, in that, does it almost feel like needing to have allies kind of shows that we're nowhere near where we want to be?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, it would be great if we didn't need that. I mean, sorry, I find it's always a difficult question to answer because it's really hard for me to see it from an ally point of view if you're not an ally, you know, if you're not that person. I think, you know, I think there are various things somebody who's an ally can do, you know, asking educated questions and doing your own research on stuff to find out about stuff. speaking up, obviously, for underrepresented if it's appropriate, following the lead of LGBT colleagues. Getting comfortable with being uncomfortable was one of the phrases I thought was interesting when I was looking into this. But, you might well be challenged, or things might be challenged, and recognise that, in that sense, there's privilege, recognising your privilege and using it for good.
I completely agree with what you said, Sarah. So for me, like, I'm not interested in whether somebody calls himself an ally or not. And I actually think kind of like debating, what does an ally mean? What does it mean to identify as an ally? I just think that's a big distraction. Those are not interesting or useful questions. But I think if you want to support LGBTQ people, read and listen to what LGBTQ people have said, including in the past, thinking about LGBT History Month. Recognise that we do not all think the same thing by any means. Make your judgments and act accordingly. It's about the actions. The identity is meaningless. It's about the actions. And just try to be kind and open and generous, as we all should be with everybody. I think about that a lot in terms of myself as somebody who tries to support anti-racist work. And as Sarah's kind of pointed out, I know that there are lots of times when I try to support anti-racist work that I'm going to fuck up, and that I am going to do something really stupid, and I'm going to I'll be made to feel really uncomfortable. And I think it's about digging into that and not shying away from that, and thinking, not kind of like running away from these things because they do get quite challenging and uncomfortable to us personally. I think that's really important, and to focus on the action over the kind of identity of allyship.
Yeah, I just want to second that point, really, Nick, that, I think the main thing that I thought about here was just sort of, walk the walk, don't just talk the talk. And I think, kind of words are great for a lot of things, but in this kind of context, it's really important about, what are you doing? If you say you support kind of LGBT plus people, sort of, how is that actually happening, in reality?
I think they're really good points.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think
Sorry,
you put that a lot more eloquently than me. I also think, a lot of people do a lot of online activism, and I think taking your online activism, using it in real life scenarios as well is important. But I think being open and kind is the best way of putting it, really, and just which you should be in about everybody and all different types of people. So I think that's brilliant.
And back to LGBT History Month in general, it gives us an opportunity to look how far we've come over the years. How much further do you think we need to go? We've seen only this month about how soldiers, for example, who were sacked because they were gay, are only just getting their medals back. And those sort of stories really do kind of shine a light on how ridiculous those situations were all those years ago.
I guess thinking about how much further we have to go, picking up on something Sarah mentioned earlier, I think there's, in the UK at the moment, there's so much kind of tension and debate and kind of issues around trans rights and kind of trans, just trans people's lives. And I think that, there's so much further to go around those conversations, and just kind of ensuring that people's rights to just live their lives and exist aren't kind of just constantly questioned, because that just, seems to be, with kind of all the recent kind of legal aspects and all of this stuff in the media and these kind of, it's just so polarized. And I just feel very sad about it, because it sort of feels like, there's so much adversarial stuff when there really doesn't need to be. So I think on that part of the LGBT acronym, we have the furthest to go, arguably.
You only have to look at the fact that all of the stuff around the Gender Recognition Act, that's been paused by the Tories. And I think, for me, that's certainly in my role at the university, and also I'm involved in my local Labour Party as LGBT officer and stuff, that I've noticed that trans issues are the ones that in the forefront, and the ones that I'm having to post positive stuff about a lot to try and kind of change the language around that. In terms of the soldiers, I think, looking at what's been written about that, people are saying that's a great first step, but there's much further to go. There's some of them have criminal records, that they've lost pension rights, they've got stuff on their service records. So, there's in that and in a lot of other things, there's so much further we can go, so much more we can do.
I think Nick as well, I mean, just talking to a Scotsman here as well, the issues that are going on in the Scottish government at the moment, the SNP, about trans rights, and there's been a lot of talk about that and how they need to sort that out, and they need to sort out transphobia as well within their own party. It kind of shows again, it's being brought to light at a very high profile level, that it showcases how much further we need to go.
Yeah, definitely. And I do understand that those issues are primarily right now around trans people. But I think, as a lot of trans people themselves have pointed out, is that lurking behind a lot of this stuff are people gunning for lesbians, for gay men, for bisexual people as well. And that this kind of like spate of transphobia that's exploded across the UK is not it will not end with trans people. And in a research project I did a couple of years ago, there was a gay activist who described the kind of advances that have been made in LGBT rights as people like spinning plates. We've got all these plates kind of spinning in the air, and he said it will just take one thing for all those plates to come crashing down. There's this kind of assumption that we've progressed to this certain point and that is all now set in stone. But things could go back for lesbians, for gay men, for bisexuals and others very quickly. It is not just trans people in the firing line here. They might just be the ones who are under attack the most right now.
I think that's a really good point, actually, Nick. And I think, thinking back, being an out bisexual in the 80s and the late 80s and the early 90s, and at the time I was at Sussex University being involved in their gay salt, we were having debates about, for instance, bisexual men, should they be allowed into meetings? Was it a safe space for everybody? Which are similar arguments as the sort of arguments we're having now around trans women in bathrooms and stuff. So I think you're right. It's all an attack. I think it's all an attack on the whole community. It's just, presently it's trans people that are at the forefront of it. But I'm sure that behind it is that kind of agenda, that homophobic anti-LGBT agenda.
Moving on, how much do you think popular culture plays in changing perceptions of those who live outside of the LGBT plus community? So 2 examples here, really. We all know that It's a Sin has been a huge success. Brilliant show, heartbreaking. I think there's still a lot of myths still around HIV. It's an issue which still needs tackling among the LGBT plus community as well, in terms of more people getting tested, but outside of that as well, more people getting tested. But just watching that and understanding of the virus and how testing has changed over time, how far have we come there? How positive are shows like that? I mean, and clearly there are parallels with bringing this out at a time during a pandemic when people can relate to understanding a virus which is completely new.
Like cultural representations and kind of growing familiarity with LGBTQ people have had a massive positive impact, not just for non-LGBTQ people. I mean, for me, one of my formative experiences growing up was watching like Russell T Davies' earlier show, Queer as Folk, in the kind of mid to late 90s. And as a young, recently out to himself gay man, I think it was probably like 15 or 16 then, watching that on TV was the first time that I ever saw gay men as being presented as cool, as being anything but kind of these sad, pathetic characters who would eventually die. It was the first time that I saw gay men having fun, and I thought, maybe my life won't be terrible after all. So I think for younger LGBTQ people, that's probably a really significant thing. I have to say, I've not watched It's a Sin, not because I think the subject matter will be too kind of harrowing, but because I don't want to watch people going out and having fun at the moment when we can't do it. but I've no doubt that that's going to be really important for LGBTQ as well as non-LGBTQ people. The flip side of that is that a lot of kind of popular cultural representations of LGBTQ people tend to either be these kind of like nice, unchallenging, oh, they're just like us, only a wee bit different kind of figures, or it kind of presents the more kind of like challenging aspects of our lives, like promiscuity, drug taking, public sex, that kind of stuff, as these kind of exotic and entertaining kind of things, which can lead to us being like fetishized and objectified. So there is a balance to be struck there, certainly. But on the whole, I think these popular representations have been a big bonus.
I think It's a Sin is great. Also, Pose, I'd say, has been the programme that really made a big impact on me around, not obviously kind of representations of the kind of HIV, everything that was going on in the 80s, but also the ballroom scene. And I think that, I think they're really great in terms of representation, and it can, I really relate to what you were saying, Nick, about seeing Queer as Folk as well. That was a very formative experience for me, kind of sneaking out to watch it at like sort of 11 at night when I was meant to be in bed. But I think in terms of the whole thing about them shifting the dial, among the wider community and on a social level, I think that can be overstated a little bit. And I sort of feel like maybe that might have been more the case when there were things like, I think there was sort of Brookside or certain things in big soaps where there was sort of millions and millions of people watching the same thing at the same time. But I feel like that's different now in the current sort of TV kind of cultural landscape. So I sort of feel like a lot of people that are watching these shows are probably already kind of a bit, pro-LGBT, and then kind of, fairly open to, people from different backgrounds. So yeah, I think it's great for representation, but I don't think it's, I think it plays a part in moving things forwards. But I think there's probably actually more important things on a ground level in communities that need to happen that we should be focusing on.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I agree about Pose. I found that incredibly interesting, and particularly when you look at some of the Black Trans Life Matters protests and stuff, and knowing a lot of, again, it's a LGBT history thing, is it? Knowing a lot of the history of where a lot of that came from. I mean, a lot of people now watch things like RuPaul's Drag Race and stuff like that, but knowing where that came from, I found incredibly interesting. But as you say, I agree that it's possibly a little bit overstated about the impact that something like that can have.
I think Pose is a really great example to bring up there, actually, because I think probably one of the things that made things like Queer as Folk and It's a Sin and Pose kind of really successful representations is that they were done by the people that it was about. Pose has Black trans women involved in making it, and Queer as Folk and It's a Sin has gay, bi and queer men involved in making it. And I think that's really important, and it lends a gravitas and an authenticity to it that you can't get otherwise.
A personal interest of mine, because it's something that I've covered quite a lot as a journalist, is the issue of sport, and especially men's sport, which is feels like it's way behind the rest of society. Pretty dark age stuff, I think. There are no out men's footballers like in the world at a top level, which is statistically crazy, isn't it? It's really bad, and it seems that comes out of a fear of abuse, which actually we have been seeing over the last month in terms of racial abuse online of footballers recently, which isn't going to help anything, clearly. But it seems like it comes out of fear of abuse that, what actually would be a very small minority is stopping sports people to be openly gay. And there's huge work to do there, isn't there? And it really strikes me a lot of the time when I'm covering this, that it just feels a long way behind so many other areas of society. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I'm not going to lie, sport, not not my remit, but I know that there are definitely gay, bi and queer men, at least, who have tried to work on greater kind of LGBTQ inclusion in men's football. And I think I've read kind of lots of stuff that kind of says things like, oh, you know, like homophobia is massively in decline in football now, and that's a thing of the past. But I actually had a student write about this for an assessment they did recently, which they had to kind of like base on their own experiences. And he said in his essay, much more eloquently than I'm about to, he said, look, I go to lots of football games and there is casual homophobia everywhere. It's not kind of like hyper abusive or anything, but it's the casual nature of it that seems to be just kind of trickling away everywhere unnoticed. And I think that kind of casual, unnoticed stuff can have a really big impact. It doesn't have to be kind of like super violent, aggressive abuse. It's this kind of like little culture that's kind of away in the background that you can almost just kind of like pass you by if you're not on the watch out for it, which LGBTQ people are. Just hearing a word can make you think, God, this is not the place for me. So I think it's clear that there is a lot of work that needs to be done there, but I think LGBTQ groups are kind of like forming to kind of lead the way on that and to push clubs on inclusion. I think a lot of clubs have been doing some quite explicit stuff to promote LGBT inclusion recently.
Yeah, clubs do clubs and sporting organisations are doing a lot more for it. You talk about the stuff that sort of bubbles away in the background. I can tell you as a Brighton supporter, when you go to an away game, it's pretty explicit, and that's just a stereotype. But it's seen as something funny by a small group of fans, and then more people might end up singing along to it, and it's just madness.
I think that's true. And it's interesting about Brighton because, again, I've got friends and relatives in Brighton who are Brighton supporters, and they, rightly or wrongly, what they do when those chants happen is they just chant back. You know, when they get chanted, "Is your boyfriend with you?" or something, or whatever it is, they chant back. We wouldn't be interested in you, or something like that. They make a joke.
You're too ugly to be gay. Is the one that seems to
all that sort of stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. But then, I think it's interesting that it's in high levels of football. Anybody who knows anything locally about White Hawk FC and their chants, they do a load of positive. Just look at White Hawk FC on YouTube. They do positive chants about being gay and all sorts of things, and anti-racist, anti-homophobia chants, the little local team. But so you've got people like Tom Daly, who's a swimmer, and it was okay for him to come out. Gareth Thomas, I mean, I think he maybe came out after he stopped playing so much rugby, but there have been footballers who have come out once they've retired. But yes, it's interesting to me that it's football particularly, and I think that's maybe something about the culture of football and the chants and stuff like that makes it more difficult. I just think it's great that some clubs are starting to take it seriously and doing something about it, and as Nick said, LGBT groups are putting pressure on in order to do that.
I think as well, it's not only football. I mean, I'm also not a massive sports fan generally, but I do follow tennis, and I think I'm aware that there is. I think there's actually a kind of a lesbian couple in tennis that I'm aware of that both sort of play professionally. But other than that, there's on the kind of both the men's and the women's game. There's very, I can't really think of, many LGBT people at all that are out. So. I think there's still a lot of progress to be made there too. And I'm just aware at the moment as well that the Australian Open is currently on, and one of the courts at that tournament is named after a famously quite a tennis player who had quite a lot of quite negative views about LGBT people. So that's also something that I think needs to be challenged and questioned, and more pressure put to sort of to make changes there, because again, still plenty of progress to make.
And there is a lot of calls to change the Margaret Court Arena to be called something else. It does seem to be more acceptable in women's cricket in general. But moving on from that, I want to finish by two things really. Firstly, I want you all to pick one inspirational story from LGBT history that really resonates with you. So this is different from a question I'm going to ask in a minute for a role model from history. So I'm going to go through all of you. Just tell me what it is and why it means something to you. So who would like to go first?
I think for me, this is a story from LGBT history, but it's also a story from my history, which is the fight to repeal Section 28 in Scotland, which came a few years before the similar fight in England. But I was in my final year in what in England would be called my sixth form at that time, and there was a huge and very, very homophobic campaign against repealing that. Sorry, I should explain what Section 28 is, because I'm sure a lot of people don't know. Section 28 was a piece of legislation implemented under the Conservative government in the 1980s, which forbid the teaching of I think the exact words were homosexuality as a pretended family relationship in schools. The wider effect of that was that LGBTQ issues did not get discussed in schools. There was even if it was, I think, never really kind of prosecuted, there was a culture of fear created. And so LGBTQ issues were never discussed in schools because of this piece of legislation. And I grew up knowing that. I knew that some of my teachers were gay, but it was always shut down. Any discussion about that, the other teachers would shut that down because they knew the problems that could emerge. And then the debate to repeal that in Scotland happened in my final year in high school. And I remember, as somebody who was newly out to myself, and I don't think I was out to any of my friends or schoolmates or classmates or anything. I'd be very surprised if I was. That had a huge effect on me, to see LGBT people like campaigning for this positive step, which would have had such a massive impact on my life at school. That was really empowering for me to see, oh my God, there's people who are going to fight for this. There's people like me who are going to do something about people in my situation. That had a huge impact on me. And the fact that campaign was ultimately successful is what makes it like a super inspirational story for me.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to use the same example because I was actually involved in Brighton in the Section 28 campaign, and one of the people who was helping organise stuff like the first march. And it was a massive, personally it was, but more politically, I think it was really interesting because it brought together a very disparate group of people, all different types of people. All different groups of people who hadn't worked together before, and it was brilliant. You know, there were trade unionists, there were radical feminist groups, there were groups of gay men, there was or just other political parties, all different types of people, all involved in the same campaign. And I got involved through my then trade union because I was in the TGW at the time. I think I was 28 or something. But it was an amazing campaign, and it was inspirational, and you know, it's how I ended up coming out, because I kind of realized stuff about myself by being involved in that campaign. And I just think it was and it was done in such a different time. You know, we didn't have social media, we had to do phone trees and leaflets and direct, you know, actions on the street, just turning up at places and doing things. So yeah, that for me was an inspirational campaign, and I think, and as Nick said, it was eventually successful as well. So sorry to do the same thing, but that was my kind of most memorable campaign.
Okay, I'm going to do something completely different now, which is, and I guess this is kind of more cultural history, and it's quite something that's quite personal to me, and also much more in the present, which is basically over the pandemic, since kind of we've been in lockdowns, there've been this really amazing online queer clubbing kind of events that have sprung up. One of them in Canada called Club Quarantine, I think, but the one that I've been to more is called Queer House Party. And I guess, you know, I don't know if like we'll look back on like these things as sort of an important part of LGBT history, but for me, they're a really important part of kind of my current kind of, you know, sense of being connected to the community and just sort of celebrating who we are and the creativity involved. And I mean, I think really probably one of the most positives about Queer House Party is that it's not just about, right, let's just get on Zoom and dance around and kind of be really silly, which is, you know, which is a big plus for me, but it's also that they're very political and they're very much about sort of raising awareness of like LGBT refugees and issues there. They're promoting a lot of things around kind of sex workers who have kind of, sex workers from lots of different backgrounds. And also just, the kind of inequality that that obviously that's facing a lot of the country, but also, a lot of kind of LGBT plus people kind of living in poverty and kind of really struggling in the current times. So I think it's, they're really bringing such a great mix of fun, but also, kind of raising awareness of important issues. So for me, that's been just a really, really lovely thing to be part of, and I think it will kind of be making a big difference to a lot of people through the history that we're living through right now.
Great stuff. And then finally, I'm going to ask you all to pick from LGBT history. I want you all to pick a role model and explain why they mean something to you. So I think we'll go around in the same order again. So Nick, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry to kind of give an academic's answer to this again, but I'm going to pick another academic who people may well have never heard of before. But I think my role model would be Professor David Halperin, who is an American academic. He is probably one of the world's leading authorities on gay men's identities and cultures. I think he's a real role model of mine for a number of reasons. I met him a couple of years ago and found him, for an extremely senior academic, incredibly kind, incredibly generous to younger scholars. And then in terms of his actual work, he has done so much in fleshing out, exploring and explaining the history of men desiring other men across millennia. He's done stuff right back to ancient Greece and Rome. And I think the kind of approach he takes is one that's not afraid to rock the boat when it comes to discussing the kind of less squeaky clean elements of gay men's cultures. And that includes also some of the parts of gay men's cultures that people think are a bit naff or dated now. Things like the opera and the theatre and particular old camp films and stuff. And he's done a lot of work around that, which I think is really important, not to kind of ditch that stuff as being passé and uncool now. So I think from an LGBT History Month perspective, and also from a kind of a personal supporting perspective, he's definitely a massive role model of mine.
This was the question I found most difficult because it isn't something I really think about.
Is it me?
Particularly, yes, it is. Thinking back to, and I'm particularly trying to think maybe about people who may be bisexual who are role models as well. And the person that brought to mind when I was thinking about things that inspired me was actually music, was Skin from Skunk Anansie, who is an amazing bi black woman who is a very powerful, leader of a band and just a really amazing person all round. I found out recently she actually did a degree at Teesside Uni, which makes me like her even more. She did an interior design degree at Teesside Uni, where I come from. But just to see a sort of a woman, unconventional, shaved head out there fronting a rock band, I found really inspirational. And she still carries on being an inspirational person. So I don't know a huge amount about her, but she was somebody that I remember seeing and thinking, wow, she's absolutely amazing, and isn't it great to see people like that on the
Incidentally,
telly.
the first live gig that I ever went to was Skunk Anansie. Absolutely incredible. And yeah, she was so kind of open about her love for women. She said at the end of it, I want all the lesbians to come up on stage. It was an incredible experience. So yeah, that's amazing.
I think Skin is incredible as well. For me, actually, do you know what? I was going to go with someone else, but I've just changed my mind. There is quite a difficult one because I think I'm inspired in kind of culture generally by a lot of different LGBT people. But someone that I really love is Janelle Monae, who's just this queer kind of singer, actor. She's one of those people that wears like a million different hats, but but also just I think kind of is really unique. I think you know, I think she was kind of working with Prince kind of shortly before he died, and he sort of almost saw her as like a kindred spirit in terms of someone who just totally does their own thing. And yeah, and I think she, you know, I guess I've been saying earlier today about like, you know, just wanting to find like joy and creativity and that sort of thing. And like the last album she released was all about kind of living your, you know, kind of authentic life, and sort of almost doing that despite all of the bombs falling, you know, the metaphorical bombs falling around you, I guess. So yeah, she's someone that I find really inspiring. And yeah, I'm just kind of in awe of how, you know, talented and sort of yeah, again, authentic she is in everything she does.
Great answers. Look, all of you, thank you so much for your time. It's been great having you on. We could have chatted for so much longer about all different kinds of topics, I'm sure, but thank you so much for giving up your time to talk to us for this episode. If you want to find out any more information about some of the support that the university provides, please go to the website brighton.ac.uk. Share this if you can on social media as well. Thanks for listening.